Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the Baker Institute. We are truly delighted to have with us the 72nd United States Secretary of the Treasury, the Honorable Paul O'Neill. Tonight we have what the French call an embarras de richesse, an embarrassing surplus of riches, because we're also joined by the Honorable James A. Baker III, the 67th United States Secretary of the Treasury. In the Ford administration, Gerald Ford's administration, James Baker met Paul O'Neill when Baker was the deputy director of OMB. So with so much talent in the room, we should be able to resolve deficit problems tonight. The subject of our speaker's presentation, Leadership in the 21st Century Economy, Lessons from the Financial Crisis, could not be more timely, as you all well know. Just over 2 years ago, the sudden decline in housing prices and the financial crisis resulted in the worst economic downturn our country has faced since the 1930s. Nationally, unemployment is just under 9%, and the recovery remains tenuous, shocked now by what's happening in Japan and what's happening, this tectonic shift in the political landscape in the Middle East. And analysts are also divided, as you could read in the press and the media, over the precise causes of the crisis. Furthermore, government financials are in bad shape. In 2010, the federal government ran a deficit of $1.3 trillion, and the Obama administration has projected a deficit of $1.65 trillion for 2011. For his part, our speaker was an outspoken critic on the complexity of the nation's tax code and made a very vigorous call for tax reform. Our distinguished speaker has much more to say on these important subjects. A longtime public service leader, he was appointed Secretary of the Treasury by President George W. Bush in January of 2001. In the aftermath of the September 11th tragedy, he utilized the Department of Treasury's resources to vigorously fight terrorist financing and work with Middle East countries to stop money laundering and fraud in charitable organizations. Secretary Paul O'Neill was chairman and CEO of one of the most important companies in America, Alcoa, from 1987 to 1999, and retired as chairman at the end of 2000, having brought that company to new and successful corporate heights. So please join me in welcoming the Honorable Paul O'Neill.
Thank you, Ambassador. I guess I'll put this here. Thank you all for being here. Nice to see you. I'm anxious to get to the part where you're going to ask me questions, and so I'm going to be brief in setup remarks. So I think there are really important lessons to learn from our financial crisis, and they're really straightforward and simple, and we all know them. When you violate fundamental economic principles over a period of time, eventually you're going to hit the wall. Right? So we did. So what's some examples of that? In 2007, the first 6 months of 2007, here in the United States, 30% of all the mortgages that were written in that first 6 months of 2007 failed to make the first payment on the mortgage. You know, one of the things, I think that's a really important lesson, that we need to use the ever more amazing information technology that we have available to us to put important facts in front of our face in an unmistakable way. You know, so that if the federal government had been saying to people in the first 6 months of 2007, 30% of the mortgages we're writing are no good, we still had time, arguably, to stop the music. That's an important lesson. You know, one of the things that I did when I was at the Treasury was to work on kind of in-house Treasury things. Part of this I learned from my experience at Alcoa. When I was at Alcoa, We had 340 operating locations in 43 countries around the world. And every Friday afternoon at 12 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I had 27 business unit presidents who all reported to me. I'll tell you more about it. I had 27 people reported to me. And they were obligated every Friday at noon Eastern Standard Time to post at most 2 or 3 screens of information on the computer that addressed the question, what happened where you are in the past week that we're sharing with 140,000 people who work for the company all over the world. And I tell you what I got out of that was an enormous amount of information that helped me understand what was going on in the world economically and socially than anything I could find in the newspapers or on television every Friday. So it took me, maybe 3 or 4 hours to read all this stuff. But when I went to the Treasury, what I found is they were slaving over data from the Commerce Department that was 6 months old as a basis for thinking about the world and where it was. And so I said, we need to have something approaching Alcoa's real-time information system so that we have a basis for knowing better than the people on CNBC what the hell's going on in the world. And so we began putting the building blocks in place so that after 9/11, this stuff really works. After 9/11, the Council of Economic Advisors and Larry Lindsay, the head of the National Economic Council, all the people who relied on old-fashioned models for their understanding of the economy believed we were going to have negative GDP growth in the quarter after 9/11. So I had all this data that I had arranged now to get from people by calling them up and saying to the CEO of Gap, I need to know every Friday what's going on in your place. What are your sales? What are the same store sales? From Sandy Weil, what are the credit card purchases? I'd like to know every day. So I kept saying we're not going to have a negative quarter after 9/11. You know what? We didn't. We had 2.7% real GDP growth, okay? So one of the lessons that we need to actually project forward from that time is the utility of using our brains to apply to economic affairs so that at a minimum we're not surprised when things fall apart, because there are warning signals, right? The 30% failed to pay the first mortgage was a huge warning signal that we're over the top here. So underneath that's a really basic principle. People who can't afford homes shouldn't own homes. Lessons learned. Do we really need to learn that? Well, I'm here to tell you, I don't think the learning's over yet. So Senator Corker called me when they were working on the financial reform bill, and he said, I'm sure you're paying attention to what we're doing. What do you think? And so I said, at this point it was only 1,500 pages. It ended up being 2,500 pages. But I said to him, you've got too many pages. And he said, what do you mean? I said, you only need 2 pages. You need 1 page that says, after the day of enactment of this legislation, it shall be illegal in the United States for anyone to give or receive a home mortgage without a 20% equity down payment. And then we need to say the 20% shall be forever stapled to the mortgage instrument, so it can't be diluted by trading and financial engineering and derivative practices and all the rest of that stuff. That's the first page of the bill. And the second page of the bill says, in the United States of America, it shall be necessary for every financial institution to have a 20% reserve, so that the financial system will never be in danger of cratering again. And he said to me, well, that's right, Paul, but we can't do that. right? So today, if you want a home mortgage from the FHA, you can get it with 3.5% down. I don't think that's enough. And we kicked to Basel the question of what kind of basic reserves ought to exist in financial institutions, and they're talking about 7%, right? Well, 7% is better than where we are, but it's not 20. All right, so I'm concerned that there are some pretty obvious things that we should take from what was a near-death experience for our economy, and we ought to do it sooner rather than later. Now, on a broader basis, there are other things that we should learn from this near financial meltdown, and they have to do with the way our society functions when it comes to financial matters. So you're all schooled people, and you know that we have 80 or 85 trillion dollars worth of unfunded liabilities. You know, and the ambassador mentioned the the current deficit, which is not to sneeze at, but it's not 80 or 85 trillion dollars worth of unfunded liabilities. That's really a problem. I honestly, I'd rather this year's deficit wasn't as big as it is, but I'm a heck of a lot more worried about our economy hitting the wall when we get to a point, if we don't make a course correction, where people won't take our paper anymore. Which means they don't believe we can pay the interest on money they would loan us. I'm not here to tell you it's going to happen tomorrow, but it's not a static problem. Every day it grows bigger and bigger. And then I want to take just a few minutes and argue something that maybe you haven't heard other places. I believe as a country we need something that I've characterized as a productivity budget, especially for important areas of public policy. So what do I mean by that? Let me talk about primary and secondary education and about health and medical care. And let me start with health and medical care. It's where I've spent a lot of time over the last, from when I first went to what was the Bureau of the Budget in 1967, in a lot of different ways working on health and medical care. So let me tell you what I mean about a productivity budget for health and medical care. Today, as a nation, we're spending about $2.5 trillion a year on health and medical care. $1 trillion of that is waste. That's a lot of money. So let me connect it to you. 1.7 million people in this country who go into a medical facility, get an infection they didn't bring with them, which either prolongs their hospital stay by an average of 30 days or kills them. You know what? We know how not to do that. We know a lot about bacteria and how to keep it away from people in a hospital. And if you've been in a hospital, you've seen all of the dispensers with alcohol-based gel. So if you go to a really great place, I'll tell you one. This is a few years old, but Mass General had a change of leadership, and they said, please come and talk to us because we know you have a lot of ideas about these things. So I said, okay, but I'd like for you to do something for me. For the week before I come, I'd like for you to have somebody do observation of the people who are delivering care and see how frequently they do the agreed and understood hand sanitizing process. So the answer was 28% of the time at Mass General. Do you think it's better here? You haven't been there. Okay. Now, it's not just about infections. In our country, every year, there are 300 million medication errors. That's 700,000 or 800,000 every day, folks. Every day. There's one patient fall for every acute care bed in the United States every year. You know, we know how to prevent falls, right? Including putting people's mattresses on the floor. I mean, some of this is not mysterious stuff, right? But if you look at all the things we do, let me connect to you a different kind of a way. So you all go into a caregiving facility now, and they give you a form. It's a HIPAA form, and you have to sign it and initial it in 3 places. You probably read it or read the first paragraph of it the first time you ever saw it. It's really there because the Congress decided we needed to provide a way to protect patients' privacy. So that form is a marker that says, you sign this form and we'll protect your privacy, right? That's what that's about. You know what they have to do with those forms after you sign them? They have to keep them in storage for 5 years. You know how much it cost our country to have that paper flurry? $500 million a year. Do you think it's worth it? $500 million a year. You know, for a fig leaf that doesn't really produce higher levels of patient privacy. You know. So if you go into a hospital ward and you watch what nurses are doing, 20 percentage points of their time is spent hunting and fetching for things that aren't where they're supposed to be, or they're not ready for use. The meds aren't there, the IV poles aren't there, or they haven't been sterilized so they can be used. You know, this is all basic stuff that just goes on and on and on. And part of it is there because of the way we've elected to educate people in health and medical care. You know, so you would think, if you understand something about systems, that where people are expected to work as teams, we would train them as teams. But we don't, right? So nurses get trained separately from pharmacists and from radiologists, technicians, and from docs, and from all the rest of that, and then we throw them all together. And on top of that, we have a system that's unbelievably hierarchical and disrespectful. You know, so I've been engaged with a group, so we've been writing things about this, you know, and trying to get people to understand it's hard to have a high-performance organization where it's normal for a doctor to say to a nurse, why is it, nurse, when I ask my dog to fetch something, he brings it to me, and you can't seem to do that? And that's acceptable behavior? You know, so I'm telling you war stories, but to give you a sense that there is this enormous opportunity for improvement in outcomes from medical interventions, beneficial to the patients, respectful of the patients, and save $1 trillion a year. That's my notion of, you know, would you rather ration medical care or raise the productivity level? You know, for me, it's a no-brainer. I know what I'd like to do. So let me take you a little in a different direction, talk about productivity. So 30% of our 10-year-olds can't read and write and compute. That's a lot. You know, and it has the unfortunate characteristic when children can't read and write and compute when they get to be 10, of becoming a lifetime liability. You know, it's like maybe having a car with 3 wheels or 2 wheels, if you can imagine that, right? So why is it we tolerate that? Why, you know, and I would say, you know, we've had a lot of chest thumping about this subject over a long period of time. It's not that it's been an unrecognized problem. And we've tried a whole variety of different things, beginning with my early days at the Bureau of the Budget when Head Start was the rage, right? And we saw after a few years that the Head Start gains kind of wafted away after a period of time. So we created follow-through, so Head Start's not enough, then we got to have follow-through. And now we've really gone to extreme, so we have remedial reading in college, right? I mean, these things really have consequences. So, what if we decided that we were going to figure out a way to have something approaching 100% productivity in helping children, our children, achieve intellectual independence by the time they're 10? Well, it would require us to rethink how we intervene. Because basically what the system is telling us is while the one we have works well for 70% of the kids, or reasonably well for 70%, it doesn't work well for the other 30%. So as an industrialist, let me race back and forth between things that I've done. When I had a plant that was producing reliably 30% trash, I'd do something about it. I'd re-examine how does this process work, and how do we stop producing 30% waste with valuable raw materials. I wouldn't just say, charter schools and choice and a whole bunch of other fancy stuff. I'd actually work in a careful, methodical way to redesign a system that produced success 100% of the time, not just for 70% of the kids. All right, so I tell you these productivity things because one of the things I'm really worried about is letting the solution, in quotes, to our fiscal and financial problems be designed by accountants. Right? If we let this be about accounting, we're going to do great damage to our society. All right? So the idea that we should ration medical care is crazy when there's this alternative that's better for everybody in every way. All right? So I hope we don't have to hit the wall before we can couple politics to economics in a useful way. And I want to pick up just for a minute on one of the things the ambassador said to you. When I was appointed Secretary of the Treasury, I really believed it was my obligation to my sworn duty to imagine perfect, right? So I've been around federal government activity since 1961, and I was already pretty knowledgeable that our tax system was terrible. In fact, when Sam Nunn and Pete Domenici tried to reform the tax system in the early 1990s, I got Bob Lutz from Chrysler to join me, and we created a support group to try to get the subject on the table as it was on the table when you were there, Secretary, in 1986, when Reagan and you and Bradley and Rostenkowski were there and did a really credible job of fundamental tax reform. So, by the time I got there, the tax code was 10,000 pages long, and I was fond of going out and giving speeches saying, the U.S. tax code proves we're not an intelligent people. Right? Because intelligent people would not design this tax code. And we need to fundamentally reform it. And so I set out to collect all the very best minds in the country to write papers addressing the subject of fundamental tax reform. And I must say, they were a brilliant set of collection, a 5-inch book of great papers. And I was told by the chief of staff, if you ever let that see the light of day, you're a dead man. Because the people in the administration did not believe that we should be putting fundamental tax reform on the table. The need today is more desperate than it was in 2001. It costs us $300 billion a year to administer this system. It undercollects what people are supposed to pay to the tune of $400 billion a year. And I think maybe more importantly, the worse all this becomes, the more I think where people have a fundamental connection with their government is around their tax system. The more we have of non-compliance and non-paying and the sculpted loopholes for individuals, the more we destroy or do damage to the idea of a society that's together. It's more about individuals than it is about a society that's trying to go someplace together. So I believe the need for fundamental tax reform today is a really important companion part of working on our financial future. And yet, Secretary and I have talked about this a little bit. I'd like to start with some really radical ideas because I think they would serve us well, at least to have the conversation. So how would you like it if we eliminated the individual tax system? No more deductions, no more credits, no more filling out those tax reforms. And how about if we simultaneously got rid of the corporate tax system? Because after all, maybe you all won't join me in this, but I hope it's not a secret to you that corporations get the money that they use to pay taxes from the prices they charge for their goods and services. They don't have another place to get that money, right? So they're really a tax collector. They're not a taxpayer. Because at the end of the day, here's an economic principle that has always been true. I think it will always be true. That if you have responsibility for capital, if you don't earn enough money to pay the cost of capital, you're going out of business, right? And that means after you pay all the taxes and everything, right, you've got to earn a competitive cost of capital or you're going out of business. Now, one of the things that's interesting in our society, if you're really big, let me use General Motors as an example, you bleed to death from the capillaries, and it may take 40 years, but you're still going to die, right? So why not get rid of corporate taxes? And we could have an interesting conversation about how are we going to collect the money that's necessary for agreed public policy purposes, including national defense and intelligence and education and health, all the other things that we care about. We ought to have an adult conversation about that. I personally believe people who don't have anything probably can't pay anything. Right? So people who do have something are going to have to pay something. Then we have a conversation about how do we distribute the burden. And there are a variety of ways to do that. One way is to have a value-added tax, which flows through the system. And just so you understand, this is not a walk in the park. A value-added tax to replace our current federal tax system probably requires a value-added tax between 30 and 35%. Right? I mean, it's not a small number, but it's the real number. And today we delude ourselves with, credits and deductions. And one of the great virtues of getting rid of the current system the way we have it, it would remove all of the fundraising opportunities that are associated with getting members of Congress to do something special for you. That would be really cool. So I'm going to quit so we have some time to engage you. I hope I provoked you a little bit.
Well, Well, thank you, Secretary O'Neill. Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Baba. I am president of the Baker Institute Student Forum, and we are so pleased that we were able to attend this event and help make it a reality. And so I'll just be moderating the Q&A session, so if you could please raise your hands, we'll try to cover as many questions as possible in the time we have remaining.
You already had two. I'm kidding. Go ahead.
Mr. Secretary, in your opinion, who are the fundamental agents to blame for our current financial crisis, and how do you feel we should best resolve our economic troubles?
You know, let me teach you a little bit about history. You know, I told you about the huge unfunded liabilities we have. So I want to do a little vignette. Earlier, Secretary Baker and I were reminiscing about the people we've known and worked with and loved. One of those people was George Shultz. So in March of 1973, George Shultz was the director of OMB, and he was called to testify before the Senate Appropriations Committee on the budget that President Nixon had submitted a month or so before, and as associate director, I went with him. So I sat next to George Shultz when he said to the assembled senators, if we don't do something about Social Security and Medicare, we're going to have an intergenerational war that will make people's hair curl. This is George Pratt Shultz, March 1973. You know, the problems we have now have been growing like yeast for decades, you know, so the roots go back a really long way. And there are a lot of smart people who know about these problems and understand these problems. But somehow our political system has not been able to couple its machinations to the underlying problems that just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think it's really the dilemma of our time. And I wish I could say, you know, there are high hopes, but the ideological division, kind of the increasing movement away from the middle and the polarization at great distances for the center lines of political parties, I think don't bode very well for a useful economic solution. You know, and it's a really interesting thing to, I've watched this now for 40 or 50 years. I think we as a people are really great at responding as a general matter to crisis conditions and pulling together when we need to. You know, and that's okay for certain kind of things. But it's not okay for a problem that's metastasizing and growing like a cancer, which is what this is like, you know, because it's not subject to a quick fix where we can say, oh my God, we're sorry we did all that bad stuff and we're going to fix it tomorrow. It's a kind of a problem, the kind of problem we have is a kind of a problem that could fracture a society and our place in the world if we don't begin to deal with it fairly soon. You know, we've basically gotten grace now for 40 years, and I think we're running out of grace period.
Mr. Secretary, you talked about important sectors of the economy and big issues in the economy. Could you talk a bit about energy policy and energy security?
You know, there's some of these things that are so aggravating because they have the same kind of characteristics. So, you know, when I was at OMB and had an opportunity to be involved in everything across government and the private sector, you know, a couple of things which I still think are right. When we shut down nuclear power in the middle 70s, that was a really bad mistake. And the way we've we now have some things on the drawing board, and we're talking about we're going to build some more, which all gets set back by what's happened and happening in Japan right now. But not only have we not done nuclear power, but in early 1990s, some political figures decided we needed to take further steps about nuclear power, so they cut off all the funding for what's called a fast breeder reactor. Some of you who know about nuclear power know that this is the potentially next great step in energy generation, because it is orders of magnitude better than conventional nuclear power, and it has the virtue of using spent nuclear fuel from the current technology as a fuel. So we have this dilemma about the mountains in Nevada, and we can't agree where we're going to put the spent nuclear fuel. We could put it into fast breeder reactors if we hadn't stopped developing the technology. So I think we need to do some things. I had an opportunity to say this to the current president when he was running for president. At the time, some of you would remember this was in the summer of 2008. We had $4 a gallon gas. And I said to him, instead of what you're saying about, you're wringing your hands about $4 gas, you ought to be saying to people, hallelujah, we need $4 a gallon gas, because it'll change the economics in favor of better answers than relying on oil from the Middle East or being in the hands of those people. It'll change the equation between natural gas and gasoline. And it was interesting. I forgot the number, but we drove in July of 2008, 12 billion miles fewer because gas prices were $4. Prices really work. They do really work. But again, politically, we're not willing to say right now. You're seeing people out there saying, oh my God, $4 a gallon. Maybe we ought to be really, maybe we ought to legislate $5 a gallon. But that's not the populist way of dealing with the fundamental problem. I don't know, coupled to this whole energy question is a whole set of environmental questions. And, people are entitled to have their own view about the coupling between energy and the environment. I'm one who believes this. There are two facts for sure that we know about the environment. One is that the material in the atmosphere has grown 350 parts per million, and we're on our way to 550. And we know that we're on our way to that because the way this stuff works, it has basically a 100-year half-life, and we've already put up enough stuff that we're on our way to 550. Now, do we know that that's going to create a massive climate change? I would say we don't really know that. There's some pretty interesting analyses that suggest that more parts per million are going to change our climate. So here's my proposition for you. If we know we're putting more stuff up there, what's wrong with trying to figure out how not to put so much stuff up there, right? So when I was at Alcoa, I discovered, from scientific analysis, that we were producing off gas from the aluminum smelter process every day in every smelter around the world that was 3,000 times more noxious than carbon dioxide. So I called my scientists and said, tell me about this. Why are we doing this? And they said, what's the way we control the process? So if you think about how we want to get the highest energy efficiency, what we do, it's like being in a tunnel. There's a white line down the tunnel. And what this off-gassing does, every time we run into the wall that pushes us back toward the center line, we off-gas this 3,000 times awful stuff. So I said, is running into the wall the only way we can control this process? And they said, it's always been like that. So really, so in a year's time, we figured out how to stop running into the wall. And you know what? It was better for us economically. We stopped putting stuff in the atmosphere, and we saved a hell of a lot of money because we were more energy efficient than we'd ever been just by asking a question. And I believe there are an awful lot of things like that where we could be benefited economically and reduce the insult we're putting into the atmosphere. What's wrong with that? Right? How can anybody object to using that mindset instead of a mindset that says, we're going to go back to the Stone Age? Right? And I object to that. I really don't. And again, it's in the same sense. I don't want to turn our economic conversation over to the accountants. I also don't want to be tied to a philosophy or a set of ideas that say we have to go backward because of somebody's thoughts about environmental degradation. We need to figure out how to have it both ways, in effect, by using our brains instead of having these mindless political conversations that have no content.
Yes. So, Mr. Secretary, I was wondering, you mentioned in one of the earlier sessions about your friends, Alan Greenspan and Colin Powell. I was wondering, what role do you think having friends such as those people played in you getting, say, Secretary of the Treasury?
Well, it's a good question. So, the ambassador mentioned in passing, I grew up in a military family. My father was a 37-year sergeant, first in the Army and then in the Air Force. And there was a period of time when he was transferred, and my mother and I and my 3 siblings lived in what had been somebody's summer kitchen that didn't have any running water, and heat was from a coal stove on a metal coal stove on legs, and that was really character building. So when I went to Washington in 1961, I didn't know anybody who lived east of the Mississippi River, really. And when I was recruited into the Bureau of the Budget, I didn't know anybody there. I had never and still have never given any political party or person money, not a dime, happy to say. And it sounds really self-serving, but I got promoted from a career up through the career ladder, so that when George Shultz asked me to give up my career status at OMB in 1971, I said to him, well, I need to go home and talk to my wife about this, because I've always thought I was going to be a career person here, because I really like working on important public policy things, and I think I'm pretty good at it. And so he said, fine. So I came back the next day and I said, I've talked to my wife, she's okay with it, but there's one proviso. It's been now 15 years or so since I'd worked in the private sector as a kind of pretend engineer in Alaska. And so when I get thrown out of here, which I certainly will, if I agree to accept an appointed position instead of a career position, you have to guarantee me, George, that you will get me a job as a janitor at the University of Chicago, because I know you have pull there because you were the dean. And he laughed and he said, okay. And then to fast forward, when I left the government, George actually arranged for me to be interviewed to be the director of the Institute of Public Policy at Chicago. and got Stanford University to offer me a vice presidency of administration, neither one of which I took. But he had never forgotten that conversation in his office, and he wanted to make sure that I knew he was there for me if I really needed him. So over my life, I've been privileged to get to know a lot of wonderful people who've been really supportive of me. And if I hadn't known some of those people, I would not have been offered the Treasury job, I think, if I was just another person on the street. But, when I was at OMB for 10 years, I was involved in every important policy decision, to the point that John Herbers, who was a famous writer for the New York Times, wrote a story for the New York Times Sunday magazine in 1974 saying people may wonder who's making the domestic policy decisions in the government since Ehrlichman and Haldeman are gone and President Nixon is diverted by the Watergate stuff. But there's this guy at OMB called Paul O'Neill who's doing all the decision making. and I tell you what, it was frighteningly true to the degree that the week after President Ford became president, I sent a memo over to the White House on some policy issue, and it came back disapproved. And I tell you what, I don't think I've had a happier day in my life that we had a functioning president, and they weren't just doing what I thought we ought to do. It's not to say that I didn't have a high opinion of what I had to say, but it was really great to have a president say, that's not it. We're not going to do what you want. That was great.
Oh, sorry. Mr. Secretary, I have read that you have participated in some activities rather unusual for someone who's held the Treasury Secretary post, such as going on a tour of Africa with Bono. I was wondering how that might have influenced you or inspired you at all.
Okay, well, let me tell you how it happened. In April of 2001, my chief of staff, Tim Adams, came in to me and said, with this tick list, well, here's one thing. Bono is here, and he's meeting with the president and Colin Powell and Condi Rice, and he specifically mentioned he wants to meet with you. So I said, Tim, I am busy. I've got a lot of things I really need to do. And he just wants to put another notch in his belt and say he met everybody, and I'm not going to do that. I'm too busy for that. So Tim Adams, who's a great Bono fan, I think, was really disappointed, but he went away and told him no. In a couple of weeks, he came back and said, Bono's back. He really desperately wants 15 minutes. So I said, okay, I give up. 15 minutes. So Bono came in with Bobby Shriver and a couple of his other people to my office at the appointed time. And in 15 minutes, Bono convinced me it was worth having more than a 15-minute conversation, because he began by telling me about, in 1985 or 86, he and his wife went to Ethiopia, and they went out in the countryside, not in the capital city, to an orphanage, and they worked in the orphanage for a month so that they could have a better understanding of what it was like to have HIV/AIDS in Africa and be in a rural place and in an orphanage to boot. And so I was frankly surprised. There are a whole lot of celebrities, and it's not that, I don't want to denigrate their celebrity and, what they do with all that. But most of them are not real about these other things that they attach their names to. So I was really surprised. This is the guy who knew something about the delivery of medications to slow down the HIV/AIDS process. He'd looked these kids in the eye. He'd had a mother say to him, take my baby because my baby has no future with me. So I said, you know what? When I was in the private sector, I spent a lot of time in Africa, and I know what it's like where people don't have clean water and they don't have a primary education. They have no hope of a civilized life. And so I'm going to go to Africa in October of 2001, and you should go with me. And I will take you and show you things that I think you need to know so you'll be better informed about the lack of civilized conditions, not just about HIV/AIDS, about the whole swath of human existence in these places. And you can take me to HIV/AIDS clinics, and we'll go together. So we agreed we were going to do this in October in 2001. Then we had 9/11. The trip was postponed until May of 2002. So he cleared his calendar so he could go with me. I had to go to a G7 meeting in Bucharest, Romania, just before this. So my plane circled back. We picked up Bono and just 3 or 4 people from his group. And we went to Ghana and South Africa and Uganda and Ethiopia. And, we went to clinics where your heart breaks to see what's going on. I still have some pictures I love of me holding this 3-month-old baby in a pink jumper, pajamas, and it was fantastic to do that. And we convinced CNN that they should send a camera crew with us. So every night we were at the top of the news. The crazy secretary and this pop singer are out there doing this stuff, but the camera showed the babies. I got Bono to sing without any accompaniment to a group of children under a forest canopy where their school was logs sawn in half, where they sat on those logs. That's where they did their learning. And he sang to them, "I still haven't found what I'm looking for." Even still, I can't say that to you without being emotionally grabbed by it. But of things I've done in my life, it was a privilege to let the world see what needs to be done. And Bono helped me do that. I thought that being Treasury Secretary was an opportunity to engage the world in a different way. So every time I had an opportunity, I did things like that. And that was a really great experience with Bono. He's truly more than a singer or the currently failed designer of Spider-Man. I'm going to actually go see it on Saturday night, so I'm going to find out how bad it is. One of the New York Times reviewers has said it's the worst musical he ever saw. So I'm going to go find out.
So, Secretary O'Neill, you mentioned a few things that you think should not be solely political, like you talked about how tax policy should be more of an economic sector, and in an earlier session, you had mentioned that you don't want foreign relations to be solely in the hands of political leaders. Yeah. So what do you think a political leader should solely be doing?
Well, earlier I told a story about, along with these opportunities, I've had a great privileges to do things that I thought made a difference. I was telling a story to an earlier group in 1995 after the Berlin Wall had come down. I was the chairman of RAND, the RAND Corporation, some of you know. So I said to the guy who's president of RAND, in my whole adult lifetime, our generation has been worried about nuclear war with Russia. And now that the wall has come down and there's some détente, I don't think we ought to leave relations between our countries to politicians. We need to begin building some bridges between non-political people in the United States and non-political people in Russia. And so we established something called the RAND Russian American Business Forum. that meets every 6 months. Since 1995, it's met every 6 months, once in Moscow, once in either New York or Washington. And the attendees are 20 big figures from American business and the oligarchs. So people like Hordakovsky are people I know as friends. He's now been in prison for quite a while, but he's a real person, and I think he's not guilty of the stuff that he's been in prison for. He's just an enemy of Putin. But getting people like John Pepper in the early days from P&G and the chairman of Boeing and the chairman of General Motors and the chairman of Heinz and other well-known American companies meeting on a regular basis with an organized agenda to talk to each other about important things that are happening in our individual countries, I think was a really useful thing to do, and something we have quite a few examples of those kinds of devices, which I think are hugely beneficial. I actually found them hugely beneficial when I was Secretary of the Treasury. The fact that I knew all the oligarchs gave me a different kind of a standing as a Secretary of the Treasury to go talk to Kudrin, who's still the finance chief in Moscow, because I knew him on a different level. It was not just 15 minutes in a conference room at a G7 meeting or a G8 meeting or something. This is somebody I'd spent days with in Moscow, in New York, in Washington. So we could have a really different kind of a conversation. And in 2001, this came back to me. He said to me, "We're thinking about defaulting on our Paris Club debt." And I said to him, "I don't think that's a very good idea. Because if you default on your Paris Club debt, it's going to be a long time before you're accepted again into adult circles in world finance." And, I'm not sure that comment did it, but they didn't default, which I think would have been a disaster for their country, but they didn't default. And I think if I had not known him so well, it wouldn't have been so easy to give him that advice in such a clear way that he went and acted on it. So there are overlaps and things but to your broader point, I think it's really important, we don't need another federal grant program, but if we could have another one, we ought to spend it providing opportunity for more and more Americans, especially people who are supposedly our elected leaders, to get to know people in other countries on a more personal level, because I think it's a lot more difficult to hate somebody if you really know them. You may not admire them, but I think we're getting better, but we need to be less navel gazing than we are. We need to have that broader perspective of the world and our place in it. And along with that, I think, we ought to be more ambitious for the contribution we can make to the world. And, again, I'm going to go back to the Bono thing for a moment. When I came back from Africa, I tried my very best to convince the president and Condi and Colin Powell that we should announce that we were going to commit ourselves to helping the people in Ghana, 22 million of them, half of whom don't have clean water. Within 30 months, we would work with them so they could all have clean water. And I had, haven't been an engineer, I'd done some calculation. I believe we could do it for $25 million. And the pushback I got said, we can't do that, because if the president makes that kind of a commitment, we don't make it happen, people think we're the laughing stock. And on the other hand, we're really concerned if you're going to make this a priority for yourself, you're probably going to make it happen, then everybody will want us to do it for them. So we can't do it. So, I'm a person who believes an important role for a leader that only leaders can do is to set truly aspirational goals for their institution, and then to systematically work on taking away all of the excuses that always exist about why we can't do it. You know, so that's what I hope and pray for in our presidential leaders every day, that they will be aspirational and work to take away reasons why not.
It seems to be that the root of all evil is this polarization in our political society today. Do you think any of the ideas that you just expressed, like the getting to know the enemy, as in the Russian, is applicable to our terrible polarization problems in this country, where we cannot even have a civil discourse?
You know, I don't know. It seems to me, as I said, that we're drifting further and further apart. And I think the lesson that politicians have taken from this is that polarization works.
It sells.
You know, it's interesting. I tell you what I believe, and I want to believe it by choice, that the American people are a lot smarter than leaders give them credit for. And you know, I actually said this to this president when he was a candidate, that I believe presidential politics should be about educating the people, not about pandering to them. And an essential role for you is to tell the people the truth as best you're able to understand it, because I think people, they may not love all of it, but they will respect you for telling them things when they think about it are obviously true, like our tax system is a disgrace. You know, I don't know why any president has any hesitation to say the truth about the tax system. You know, so I don't know, but I worry a lot, you know, because just to be topical for a moment, the President commissioned the Erskine Bowles, Senator Simpson, a task force to look at our fiscal future. And for the first time, they put on the table some really important ideas. And he basically took a pass. So that's not, you know, my idea about leadership is not taking a pass. He may be right, you know, God bless him, I hope he's right, but it doesn't resonate with me as the way leaders should conduct themselves. So I don't know how we're going to get out of this tailspin of divisive, empty rhetoric. Hard.
Okay, one last question.
Back to the economic situation and the financial crisis. Explain to me, how did the lockbox for Social Security get unlocked, or was it ever locked, or how did they get around it?
I'm so glad you asked me this question. So I'm going to tell you all about the lockbox, right? So you remember it was in a presidential campaign not too long ago where one of the contenders said not to worry about Social Security, we have a lockbox. So I'm here to tell you the truth is we have a lockbox. It's in West Virginia, and the reason it's in West Virginia is because former, now deceased, Senator Byrd took everything to West Virginia that wasn't nailed down in Washington. So there is a lockbox there. Actually, it's a government-issued filing cabinet, and in it, it has manila folders, and the manila folders have pieces of paper that say, we, the United States government, owe you, the Social Security Administration, you know, a whole heck of a lot of money. So is there any money there? No. Was there ever any money there? No. So when did we start this giant Ponzi scheme? In 1935. 1935, right? We decided that we would collect money from people and companies, right? We shared payroll taxes, and we would take the money and we would attribute it to Social Security, and we would use the money as it came in to pay benefits to retirees. And it wasn't very long before, we were using more and more of the revenue from the payroll tax to pay benefits to people already retired. We were never saving any money from the people who were contributing current Social Security taxes. There is no money in the lockbox. So it's one of the reasons, it's the same with Medicare. We have a tax that's supposed to be for Medicare. Hey, we're getting to the point where we're going to have to we're not even collecting enough payroll taxes to pay current beneficiaries, let alone put anything aside for the future. We're at the stage we're going to have to begin borrowing money from the world to pay current benefits. That's how awful it is. So there is a lockbox. It does have something in it. It's not worth anything. It's really awful. But a presidential candidate made a hell of a lot out of the notion that there's a lockbox and you don't have to worry about Social Security. It's all a lie. All a lie. Sorry about it. Can we have one more? Let's end on a happy note.
Thank you, Paul.
My pleasure.
I don't have a question. I have a point of personal privilege. After you've listened to the last hour and 15 minutes, you know what a remarkable public servant and person Paul O'Neill is. He didn't get his job. Somebody asked a question, did you get your job in Treasury because you knew Alan Greenspan or Colin Powell or somebody else? He didn't get his job because of that. I know a little bit about this. He got his job because of the absolutely superb job he did as deputy director of OMB and the superb job he did at Alcoa. So I want to set the record straight on that. He's too modest to tell you that, but that's how he got his job.